Jejudo Island, one of the 7 wonders of the world with 3 UNESCO Heritage Sites. Every year, this beautiful island brings together hundreds of government officials, high-profile figures, and opinion leaders from all over the world for the Jeju Forum for Peace and Prosperity. At the 14th edition of the Forum, participants discussed ways to build co-prosperity in Asia and the world under the theme Asia Towards Resilient Peace for Cooperation and Integration. To offer a closer glimpse of this multilateral dialogue, we are broadcasting from Jejudo Island this week, where I'm your host, Panita Bajaj. With panelist Todd Sample, we are going to talk about ways to build prosperity in Asia from an economic perspective.
Hello and welcome to the Chamber. This week we are greeting you from Jejudo, the island of peace.
It is wonderful to be here in Jejudo, and for our very first episode, we're going to be meeting with a very special person, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Helen Clark.
That's right, and of course we are lucky enough to be broadcasting to you guys for 2 episodes right here in Jejudo as the Jeju Forum of Peace and Prosperity takes place right here. So I guess we'll have to get into it and step into
the Chamber.
Thank you to the organisers of the Jeju Forum for inviting me to participate this year. The need to adopt sustainable pathways is very urgent before the challenges become overwhelming. And each year the United Nations is reporting on what progress the cities are making on the Sustainable Development Goal 11. I was elected 20 years ago as PM. As I said, pay gap, about 20%. Today, it's down to under 10. It's 9.2%. And it's all about women coming back into the workforce and being able to progress their careers instead of having very lengthy times out when they're not going ahead the way men are going ahead. Developing countries having
Hello and welcome once again. We have Todd Sample in the studio and a very honourable guest, former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Helen Clark. Thank you very much for joining us today. Well, first off, I know you held a special session with the Jeju Governor, Won Hee-ryong, at this year's Jeju Forum for Peace and Prosperity. Now, the title was Making Cities Resilient, the Role of Cooperation and Leadership. May I ask, how are the cities being resilient? Resilient of what? What kind of discussion was this about?
Well, firstly, I think you need to see resilience in the context of what the UN Habitat Conference in 2016 called for with the new urban agenda. And it said our cities of the future should be safe, they should be inclusive, they should be resilient, and they should be sustainable. So that's quite a big agenda for many cities. And so sharing best practice on how to make our cities all those good things is extremely important. In terms of resilience, our cities, particularly our capital cities and provincial capital cities, host a lot of essential infrastructure, the key governance institutions, so they need to be resilient to earthquake risk. This is very relevant in Korea, it's really very relevant in Kathmandu, it's very relevant in New Zealand, where we have a lot of natural hazards. So even just on the level of sharing best practice on disaster risk management, cities need to be talking and cooperating and seeing what the best practice is.
Mm-hmm. So could you elaborate a little bit more on how cities can cooperate? Of course, this process of becoming resilient is not something that cities can entirely do on their own. So being able to cooperate with other cities is something that they should definitely be pursuing. So could you be a little bit more specific about what kind of steps cities can take with each other to cooperate?
Well, from my experience in New Zealand as Prime Minister and then as a citizen watching as earthquakes and other natural hazards involve, what we do in New Zealand is we follow other people's disasters. So if there's a major earthquake in Turkey, New Zealand will be on the plane to be there. A major earthquake in Japan, our experts will be on the plane to see how they coped. We're very interested in best models of disaster recovery because in development, and that applies to rich countries like Korea as it does to New Zealand, we need to be building back better every time. We need to analyse what went wrong if we lost lives in a disaster, for example. So there's a lot of experience out there about how cities cope, how they design themselves for resilience. The UN Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, building on the Hyogo one of a decade or so before, is very much about best guidance. Now, often these conferences are aimed at central governments, but actually cities are incredibly important to building resilience because of the function that they play in society.
Okay, very good.
Well, speaking of these cities, I think there's so many different types of struggles that we face, whether it be environmental issues. A lot of neighborhoods living below the poverty line and economic inequality. How do you think we can address these issues for these vulnerable cities to cope and perhaps rise to the occasion?
So some of the things that need to be done to address poverty are clearly responsibilities of central government, but that doesn't let cities off the hook. I have visited cities where the poor are living in the most degrading circumstances, the most vulnerable to disaster, for example. When I went to Haiti after the terrible earthquake of January 2010, I saw how the poorest were impacted down the bottom of very steep ravines, no steel in the housing. So the least our cities can do, I think, is focus on how do we keep neighbourhoods safe from that kind of disaster. And when I was at UNDP, we were involved in some of the rebuilding and the redesigning of where people could live safely, and then ensuring that when they did rebuild, when they got support from partners to do that, they had to rebuild properly. They had to go through a building course. They had to only buy with vouchers from a shop which would sell them real steel, not fake steel, because if you've got fake steel, your house isn't going to stand at all. But what was also important was participatory planning, bringing the neighbourhoods in to redesign where people could safely live and where they couldn't.
So from 2009 until 2017, you served as administrator for the UN Development Program, a network which helps countries achieve their sustainable development goals. So in light of helping make cities more resilient and the SDGs, do you feel that these two are well aligned with each other?
Oh yes. At the heart of the SDGs is how do we develop economically, socially and environmentally sustainable societies. And if you don't have resilience, you can never get traction on that. If you don't have resilience, every time there's a major adverse event, your people are going to be at risk of losing everything they had. And when I was at UNDP, you would be working with the countries which were seeing more and more recurrent drought or more recurrent cyclone. And each of these devastating events, and with the speeding up in frequency of these events, often people had no time even to rebuild from the last disaster before the next one hit. Actually, for developing countries, what is uppermost in their mind with the climate change agenda is adaptation. They need support now to build their resilience to what is happening in the natural environment, which we've done so much damage to in the way that we have traditionally developed. And today, polluting and cleaning up later on the path to development is just not an option. If the whole world were to follow the path to development of New Zealand, United States, Korea, Japan, Europe, our climate would be in even worse state than it is. But that means there's an obligation on the wealthy countries, which includes Korea, New Zealand and so on, to be supporting developing countries to develop in sustainable ways.
That's the key word, sustainable.
Yeah. Well, how do you think we can help develop these countries? I mean, Korea historically has been an aid recipient for years until 2000. With this rapid economic growth, it became an aid donor. So how do you think Korea can now become, as a role model, how can they share their resources or their experiences with developing countries?
So Korea is one of the world's great development successes. If you think back to the armistice in 1953, around that time the World Bank was writing projections for Asia, and it said the Philippines is going to be the tiger economy, and it wrote Korea off as a basket case. Well, look at Korea. I mean, it graduated from development country status, joined the OECD DAC. It's had incredible human development, longevity of its people, incredible economic growth and so on. But as I say, it did it in a way which the West had traditionally developed with, and that was a rather polluting way. So for me now, I think where Korea can share ideas is in how it's cleaning up. You have a lot of sustainable technologies here. I recall as New Zealand Prime Minister and going out to Hyundai's research centre and seeing the work that was being done on the battery car, the hydrogen cell. I think you really can contribute on urban design, on sustainable environmental technologies, and of course on poverty reduction. And when I was at UNDP, we did have cooperation with Korea on a model of rural development, which Korea had used, which could be, if you like, adapted to other countries. Money does matter, it's not everything. So for Korea to be lifting its official development assistance up to the 0.7% of gross national income level is important, and it would be well short of that at the moment. But make no mistake, Korea can have a huge impact on international development.
Absolutely. Many people talk about the potential that Korea has. So we are very fast-paced. However, as you mentioned, it came with the cost with pollution that we are fighting now with the fine dust and things of that nature. But if we switch our topic, now you are the second female Prime Minister of New Zealand, first elected, and also the first female administrator of the UNDP, and also the first female guest of our show as well. So as a global female leader, what is your view on gender equality, especially here in Korea, and women's participation in the labor force? You are a strong advocate of breaking this glass ceiling, and we talk about it, but is talking about it enough?
No.
There must be action.
Well, firstly, in terms of legal equality, Korean women have it. But that's a first step. Then you have to make that reality in the workforce, in decision-making generally. And when you look at the Korean parliament, I think it's still only around 17% female. And that's under the global average, which is around 23%. And of course, we should be aiming for equality. In New Zealand, we've now gone over 40%. So we can see equality in the parliament within grasp in an election or two. In the workforce too, Korean women are still rather less represented. And generally this relates to stereotypes still in the society about what are men's and women's roles, because women disproportionately care for the family, whether it's children or the older relatives or relatives with other needs like disability or illness. So for Korean women, I think, really be pushing hard on issues like childcare, because you need good childcare for women to feel that they can go to work with confidence and know their children are looked after. Koreans are also very hard working. They probably don't have enough holidays. And if you're a working parent, you need holidays because your children are going to be out of school a lot of months of the year and weeks of the year, and you need to be with them more of the time. So I think it's really on that social side now that Korea needs to to focus, to get more women into the workforce and, of course, into decision making. On the pay gap, it's quite large in Korea. In New Zealand, it's now estimated at about 9.2%. So again, we can see, it's within grasp to eliminate this. But I do say that to completely eliminate the pay gap, actually, men's lives will need to look rather more like women's. Men need to be taking more responsibility in the family and for all the things that involves, rather than leave it to, oh, well, she can do it because somehow her work's not quite so important as mine.
That's right. Everything starts at home.
It does.
It certainly does.
Based upon what you just discussed about gender equality in regard to pay discrimination, Korea is woefully low in terms of the OECD. So perhaps a few more specific tips other than, of course, men's lives must become more like women's, but from New Zealand's example, which is, as you said, just under 10%, which is is truly excellent. So what kind of advice would you give to Korea specifically to help shorten this gap?
Well, I think that there's three specific things. One absolutely is that men and women should both be encouraged to take time out when there's small children born. Definitely childcare. Many women want to get back to work, but as I said, they need to know the children are properly looked after. In New Zealand, we acted on all these things. We went for 20 hours free childcare a week for every 3 and 4-year-old before school entrance age. I'd like to see it actually come in lower than that now. We brought in as an entitlement under law the paid parental leave. Previously it had only been available if you had a union agreement covering your workplace. And then we lengthened annual holidays. So those three things were very positive, and over time you can see the impact. When I began as New Zealand Prime Minister, the pay gap was still about 20%. Okay. Well, it's half of that now. And I became PM 20 years ago. So halved, more than halved in 20 years.
For more than half the last 22 years, New Zealanders have had a woman Prime Minister, so they kind of expect that this is going to happen, on average as often as men are Prime Ministers, and that sends a very powerful signal to girls and young women that they can go all the way in the society. So I think that role modelling at the top is important. And I think it really is important for the political parties to say, we want to encourage women to stand. We're a women-friendly environment. We want to make space for women candidates because there's an old saying, if you are out of sight, you are out of mind. If women aren't in these decision-making bodies, whether it's the government of Jeju or the Parliament of Korea or the cabinet or whatever, who's going to speak up for the specific needs and interests and perspectives that women have?
In order to achieve gender equality, many people talk about, well, let's see more women in leadership. Let's see more Helen Clarks out there, politics, economic decision-making positions, including yourself as well. So what words of advice can you give women all across the world, especially here in Korea, trying to break the glass ceiling in order to achieve these positions?
Well, I think that for women, our first obstacle is often ourselves. Because we're always questioning, can we do it? Am I good enough? It's almost like a built-in, maybe I'm not as good.
Insecurity.
And some people say that, women are likely to think that they're not qualified for something when they're 120% qualified. And men say, yes, I can do it when they're 60% qualified. So, we have to step up. We have to lean in, as Sheryl Sandberg of Facebook once said. Now, I know it's not easy. I've had to, push my way into a lot of things. But if we really want to make an impact, we have to, lean in, and even if we're not the one who's going to go all the way to the top, we have to support others to lean in. And my experience has also been that women can often be your worst critics as well as your best supporters. So, we have to look in the mirror and take some responsibility, but we also have to advocate for overcoming the structural barriers that keep a lot of women from pursuing these fast lane decision-making courses for their lives.
Absolutely. You're known as the New Zealand Prime Minister that most visits Korea quite often, which really speaks about your passion and efforts to expand the exchanges between the two nations. So what's the significance of our economic cooperation between New Zealand and Korea?
Well, when I became leader of the opposition in New Zealand at the end of 1993, and I expected, at some point to become Prime Minister, I felt it was very important to know New Zealand's major partners around the Pacific Rim. And an early country I chose to visit was Korea for the first time in my life in 1994, and I came back in my second term as leader of the opposition. And then when I was Prime Minister, I came once every 3 years for a bilateral visit, and I also came to the APEC summit in Busan. So that was about 6 visits when I was a senior political leader, which was more than others had done. And then I continued to come as UNDP administrator, and now I come for other things, for example, as a guest of Ban Ki-moon's Centre for Global Citizenship earlier this year. So I became very conversant with the importance of Korea to New Zealand as just a very friendly country, a democracy in the region, which it was by the time I was a political leader. And is very economically important as well. But I didn't only focus on the economics. We had a film cooperation agreement and looked for, to see if there were possibilities for joint movie making and exchanging with others, festivals. And of course, some very important Korean movies have been screened down in New Zealand because we have such a wide range of scenery and very good film post-production facilities. I understand now with the Korean-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, which I worked a lot on in my time, the trade is about $5 billion each way. Now, for a small country like New Zealand, that's pretty substantial. And I think Korea looks to New Zealand, firstly for timber products, because we grow timber a lot faster than Korea does. You're far north, we've got a more temperate climate. We supply a lot of food to Korea. You supply a lot of electronics to us. I can tell you the Samsung phone is very important in New Zealand. But we're also now from New Zealand bringing in more added value groups, products, wine, for example. I understand a delegation of young ICT people is coming up to Korea in the next week or so, looking at how their products can fit into the global value chains of your major ICT companies. So it's a strong and very positive economic relationship.
So our two countries, Korea and New Zealand, launched new administrations in 2017, and since have undertaken several high-level exchanges. So based on your experience as Prime Minister, what direction do you see the two countries going towards in terms of cooperation?
Well, I think it's one of those happy moments right now where you have progressive administrations in both countries. Now, of course, having been a national leader, I know that whether or not your counterpart country has a progressive governance or not, you have to get on with it. But at this point, I think there's quite a meeting of minds because both governments are interested in inclusive and sustainable development. So that's very much a plus, and I think you would find that the President of Korea and Jacinda Ardern, Prime Minister of New Zealand, would be kindred spirits at the APEC meetings, East Asia Summit, and the other meetings that they attend together. For my part, I've really been a great admirer of the way your President has picked up the issue of peace and reconciliation with your neighbour. Of course, this is an extremely challenging matter, but he has said, I'm going to do everything I can, and whether it works or not, there should be no fault attached to his efforts. He's really put his heart and soul into it.
Well, to wrap things up, do you have anything to look forward with your visit to Jeju, to Korea?
Well, firstly, I wish it was longer because I've heard about Jeju for many years, and I know this is
your first time?
It's my first time in Jeju.
Okay.
Yes, yeah. So, and I know it's a holiday island for the whole region, really, because it's almost subtropical, shall we say? But hopefully there'll be an opportunity to come back another time and stay for longer and get away from the urban part of it and into the mountains. That would be nice.
Well, thank you very much for joining us and sharing your insights today. This brings us to the end of the Chamber. It's certainly been an inspiring time talking about the ways to achieve sustainable development and ideal economic cooperation between Korea and New Zealand with former New Zealand Prime Minister Helen Clark. Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, if you have any questions or comments regarding Korea's economy, feel free to join us on social media where we'd love to answer your curiosities. That's all the time we have for today. We'll see you next week, same time, same place on The Chamber. Thank you once again. That was a lot of fun.